Good morning, everyone. Yes, thank you for reading those quotes. And thank you to Vandra for the thoughtful introduction, and thank you to Dupree and Barry for the wonderful music. I appreciate everyone here. Thank you for joining us. Many of you are likely familiar with the 1619 Project from the New York Times. It is an ongoing initiative that began in August 2019, which was the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. The project has expanded to include a children's book, a book of compiled essays, and most recently, a docuseries on Hulu. The year 1619 represented a landmark in the long history of slavery in European colonies and the beginning stages of what would become the institution of slavery in America. Journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones is the driving force behind the 1619 Project, and she aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. Hannah-Jones argues, without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different. It might not be a democracy at all. And I would argue, just as Black Americans challenged our country and continue to challenge our country to live up to the ideals set forth in our Constitution, they pushed and continue to push ethical culture to embody its values too. One specific example of this in action is how Black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois shaped ethical culture, founder Felix Adler's views on Black freedom and dignity. In fact, ethical culture leader J. Exodus Hooper explored this topic in their experimental film, Humanitas. Hooper creatively illustrates the relationship between Adler and Du Bois. In an interview with Emily Newman of The Humanist, Hooper said they were inspired by a passage Adler wrote in An Ethical Philosophy of Life about Du Bois. Adler wrote, "I looked that night deep into a suffering, sensitive human soul, and I tried to put myself in his place. I realized the hardships of his lot, the anguish that I myself should suffer if I were in his position." Hooper said that this instance of Adler explaining a pain he would never know, the pain of Du Bois's and other Black leaders, inspired them to begin the journey that led to the creation of their film. Hooper said, Du Bois asks us how it feels to be born a problem, to be taught that Blackness is a problem or a defect to the American ideal. Adler and Du Bois were friends at a time when most intellectuals embraced racist ideas of assimilation. Many scholars thought that Black people needed to be educated so that they could conform to the ideal white norm. Du Bois challenged this approach, and ultimately Adler embraced an ethic that encourages us to develop our unique, essential selves by evoking the distinct unlikeness of others. Adler asks us to embrace our differences, to find strength in them, and to learn from one another. Like Adler, Du Bois rejected religious dogma and lived a humanist philosophy embedded with empathy, reason, and ethical action. He had a strong sense of justice, and he worked tirelessly for radical change and racial equality. He urged Black Americans to stand up for their rights. Du Bois embraced one of the foundational ideas of the ethical culture movement when he wrote, "There is no dream but deed." Does that sound familiar? Adler was advocating his belief in deed, not creed, as Du Bois's co-secretary at the first Universal Racist Congress in 1911. Adler presented a paper entitled "The Fundamental Principle of Interrelational Ethics and Some Practical Applications of It." In the paper, he explained his vision for the organization of humanity into two parts. The first promoted the utmost differentiation of the types of culture, the utmost variety and richness in the expression of the fundamental human faculties. And he warns us to avoid the universal prevalence of a single type. Adler is saying there is no one right way to live. The second part addressed how the faults, as well as the excellent feature of any type of culture, may be best detected in the effect it produces on other types. In other words, Adler is saying nations should elicit the best in one another. Du Bois wrote of the first Congress, the Racist Congress in 1911 would have marked an epoch in racial history of the world if it had not been for the World War. Felix Adler and I were made secretaries of the American section of the Congress in London. It was a great and inspiring occasion, bringing together representatives of numerous ethnic and cultural groups and bringing new and frank conceptions of scientific bases of racial and social relations of people. The color line, Du Bois wrote, was not only the most pressing social question of the modern world, but also an ethical question that confronts every religion and every conscience. Du Bois was an advocate for racial equality and self-actualization. He used science and history to dispel myths of racial inferiority. He sought to empower Black Americans. In 1909, he co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, with Harry Moskowitz, associate leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, was among one of his fellow founders. Before becoming a founding member of the NAACP, Du Bois was already well known as a remarkable Black intellectual. He was the first Black American to earn a PhD from Harvard University, and his works were published widely before he became the NAACP's Director of Publicity and Research and started the organization's official journal, The Crisis, in 1910. As I learn about their relationship, I can see Du Bois bringing out the best in Adler, calling him into his perspective and explicitly calling attention to the importance of Black culture and identities. This is a tradition of Black freethinkers and Black humanists. Humanist scholar Anthony B. Penn wrote that African-American humanism shares the human-centered emphasis of humanism, but there's a different rationale for this position based upon various forms of oppression encountered by African-Americans that were at times justified theologically. Penn explains that although African Americans have held humanist perspectives and operated accordingly for centuries, use of the phrase Black humanism as a reference is fairly recent. A passage in Empowerment, One Denomination's Quest for Racial Justice, 1967 to 1982, provides the following information concerning the use of the term, linking its use with the Black Unitarian Universalist caucus created to respond to racial issues within the UUA. And the passage reads, Black humanists understood humanism as a process, as an existential process by which one finds and lives his humanity. To be human is to direct one's own life. Therefore, Black humanism calls for a seizure of decision-making and implementation for oneself. Gaining power is an essential element of humanism. The Black struggle for bodily autonomy, for racial justice, for equality, for power, has shaped and continues to shape the Black humanist tradition and our society as a whole. We can see this at play in modern times and throughout history, time and again. But often the contributions of Black humanists and freethinkers are ignored. Instead, the myth that the accomplishments of the civil rights movement were achieved by religious, many Christian people prevails. Historian Norm R. Allen pointed out that we often hear about people of traditional religions who were involved in the civil rights movement, but we hear little about the atheists, humanists, and skeptics who championed equality. Allen argues, and I agree, that highlighting the contributions of Black humanists, both in the civil rights movement and beyond, encourages acceptance of non-believers and non-theists. I would add that it also promotes ethical humanist values and paints a more accurate portrait of our nation's history. For example, we were introduced to A. Philip Randolph in the video at the beginning of our meeting today. He is a lesser known civil rights activist and Black humanist, but many credit him with having the idea to orchestrate the March on Washington. Randolph was at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s side as he made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And Randolph once said, "Freedom is never granted, it is won. Justice is never given, it is enacted. Freedom and justice must be struggled for by the oppressed of all lands and races." Black humanist and civil rights activist Bayard Rustin was also an agent of change. Many historians consider him to be the chief architect of the 1963 March on Washington. Rustin said, "My activism did not spring from being Black. The racial injustice that was present in this country during my youth was a challenge to my belief in the oneness of the human family." And he refused to accept the status quo. He confronted justice head on and helped to mobilize 200,000 participants at the march, which was a turning point in the civil rights movement. Rustin said, "One has to fight for justice for all. If I do not fight bigotry wherever it is, bigotry is thereby strengthened." He encouraged us to be enraged by injustice, but warned us to not be destroyed by it. He said, when an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity upon him. James Baldwin is another influential Black humanist and civil rights activist you may not have heard of. Both Baldwin and Rustin were gay, and it's worth noting the intersectionality at play in their lives. Baldwin was extremely courageous to come out as gay at the time, while Rustin was forced behind the scenes. A novelist, playwright, essayist, and poet, Baldwin wrote thoughtfully on the topic of race in America. In 1953, he won the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship and published his first play, The Amen Corner. He may be best known for his book of essays, Notes of a Native Son, Nobody Knows My Name, and The Fire Next Time. Baldwin said, "Words like freedom, justice, and democracy are not common concepts. On the contrary, they are rare. It takes enormous and above all individual effort to arrive at the respect for other people that these words imply." Baldwin is imploring us to treat each other with dignity and challenging us to strive for racial justice and the formation of a truly democratic society. Like so many other Black freethinkers, he understands the ethical action it takes to strive to live our values. Novelist, activist, and folklorist Zora Neale Hurston was best known for her portrayals of racial struggles in the American South. Her strong spirit of questioning informed empathy for others and was imbued with the essence of humanism. Born to a Baptist preacher, she was skeptical of religion, even as a child. However, she did not wish to deny anyone else their rights to their own beliefs. She said, "I would not, by word or deed, attempt to deprive another of the consolation religion affords. It is simply not for me. Somebody else may have my rapturous glance at the archangels, the springing of the yellow line of morning out of the misty deep of dawn is glory enough for me." She wrote that in her autobiography, Just Tracks on a Road. After earning her Bachelor's of Art in Anthropology, Hurston traveled through the South and the Caribbean, gathering stories and dialects she would later include in her writings. Her original recordings are housed at the Library of Congress, and today she's celebrated for her contributions to the academic understanding of African American folklore and for her accurate depictions of language and oral tradition in her work. She once wrote, "Why fear? The stuff of my being is matter, ever changing, ever moving, but never lost. So what need of denomination and creeds to deny myself the comfort of all my fellow men? The wide belt of the universe has no need for finger rings. I am one with the infinite, and I need no other assurance." All of the aforementioned Black humanists put their faith in people instead of some supernatural deity. They were concerned with equality and self-determination in this life instead of the promise of a life eternal. Actress and atheist Thelma Butterfly McQueen touched on this sentiment when she said, "They say the streets are going to be beautiful in heaven. Well, I'm trying to make the streets beautiful here. When it's clean and beautiful, I think America is heaven and some people are hell." Modern Black humanists continue to challenge our assumptions and privileges, calling us in to do the work with love, empathy, and dedication. Humanists value autonomy, dignity, and equality, the same equality guaranteed to all Americans in our Constitution. And yet Black Americans have fought hard to win their bodily autonomy. They challenged our democracy to live up to its ideals. While all humanists seek to create a more fair and just society, the struggle of Black humanists is unique and impactful. Our movement is strengthened by our current Black ethical culture leaders, J. Exodus Hooper and Christian Hayden. Hayden was recently certified as an ethical culture leader. He previously worked for 5 years with the community organization Women Against Abuse in Philadelphia. He facilitated workshops about healthy relationships and teen dating violence prevention. And with several other organizations earlier, he was a facilitator and an organizer. In 2015 and 2016, he spent a year in Ghana working with the Humanist Service Corps. He is a graduate of the College of Worcester with a major in urban studies and a minor in Africana studies. Hayden said, "I want to be a leader that bridges the lessons and philosophy of ethical culture closer to the hearts and minds of people who attend and are interested in ethical culture, to inspire folks to be leaders in their own way and not leading as far as being in charge or having power, but leading as in being brave enough to do what is necessary at the moment, following, listening, being graceful while being held accountable, and challenging the status quo. I live an ethical life by trying to be reflective and concerned about my impact on the world, my impact on my community, and my impact on those closest to me." Humanism and Pan-Africanism has been twin pillars in Hayden's approach to exploring liberation and relationship. A talented photographer and poet, Hayden has been exploring the application of his humanism to photography and documentary filmmaking. He currently lives in Philadelphia. Dr. J. Exodus Hooper, who was mentioned earlier in this talk, earned their PhD in interdisciplinary arts from Ohio University. As a performer, a new leader at the New York Society for Ethical Culture, and clergy at the First Unitarian Society of Memphis, Jay's practice utilizes the body as preaching. He wants to decolonize humanism and represents the Black embodiment of intellectual thought. Hooper's word working emphasizes human freedom, and interconnectedness through embodiment, intuition, creativity, and improvisation. Hooper said, "A free thinker is the artist, an endorser of an ethical imagination, who embodies logical social disruption to reclaim meaning in life for all. We are creative clergy that disrupt the status quo. However, this also requires a reassurance of the human spirit to reveal the human condition as transcendence, creative, resilient, and legendary. The ethical life calls us to reflect good, even when circumstances, as Reverend Dr. Thurman states, can make it difficult to be fully present. This process beckons us to remain true and courageous together. Such inspiring words from Dr. Hooper. Their most recent production, Keep Living, expresses the importance of cultural care and self-care. Also, they are the clerical consultant at the Susquehanna Valley Ethical Society in central Pennsylvania, exemplifying a commitment to equity and inclusion through the arts and congregational life. Hooper enjoys working closely together to decenter the stage and share the spotlight of all those voices that make up their beloved community. These kinds of transdisciplinary approaches console and agitate communities in reimagining and reclaiming narratives that honor the inherited worth and dignity within all people, a love work that Hooper is committed to. They said, I find the purpose of human life is to seek its own meaning through a critical analysis of its being, its knowing, its lived experience. I hold these elements of human development to be the premise of shaping an ethical life. As the ethical life can be contemporaneously understood as me search, we search, and research of our relationship among one's own self and toward others. Thus, ethics in a vocation of the critical social human relationship and reflection, where love is what justice looks like in public. Besides supporting our Black leaders and learning the history of Black humanists, how can we live up to the ethical culture tradition of amplifying Black voices and championing racial equality? How can we cultivate more friendships like those between Adler and Du Bois? One way is to invite more Black people to speak at our congregations. Including more Black voices will bring diversity to our societies and strengthen our movement. Under Adler's leadership, voices of prominent civil rights leaders were amplified within our congregations. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and James Weldon Johnson were given space within ethical culture to share ideas and champion equality. We must continue this tradition. Listening to and learning from the Black humanist perspective will strengthen our movement. Instead of escaping emotional distress, we must sit with our discomfort. Humanists are brave and bold. This affirmation of bravery can allow us to withstand the discomfort needed to reconcile with the white privilege of our past and learn from those different than us. When we go through the negative emotional experiences, we tend to get the greatest strengths and the greatest outcomes. In 1963, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested during civil rights protests in Birmingham, Alabama. On his second day in jail, he was passed a copy of the Birmingham News. It featured a full-page letter about the protests signed by a group of white clergymen. This letter advised protesters that their actions were unwise and untimely. King later said, when I read it, I became so concerned and even upset, and at the point so righteously indignant that I decided to answer the letter. The result was King's famous letter from the Birmingham jail. In the letter, King wrote, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. By citing the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor, this may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but this is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. We have an impulse to turn away from anything that produces distress, to even turn away from what King called constructive nonviolent tension. But he's arguing that you cannot have growth and change without it. Undoubtedly, this tension was at play in the relationship between Adler and Du Bois. We must keep the importance of this constructive nonviolent tension in mind as we invite Black people into our mostly white spaces, as we strive to end racism, and as we devote resources to creating a more fair and just place for all people. We must think about the locations and accessibility of our meeting houses. Are we located in places where Black people feel safe? We must continue to advocate for Black lives, because all lives don't matter until Black ones do. The American Ethical Union recently issued a statement condemning the combined threats of systemic racism and materialized policing in the communities of color. In part, the statement reads, "Humane cultures and cultures of peace ascribe intrinsic worth to all people and assume all equally deserve to be treated with dignity. Such cultures reject the use of inhumane procedures and tactics in law enforcement, especially when those established procedures lead to death." The statement calls attention to the dangers of dehumanization, and it states, "In a culture of violence, the first step in attacking an opponent is to dehumanize your adversary. It is easier to kill an individual when you no longer see them as human. This dehumanization has many causes, not the least of which is systemic racism. Racism itself is an act of dehumanization." And it goes on, "Dehumanization also occurs during police training. From the beginning of their careers, police officers are trained to have a warrior mindset in which the primary goal is to not be killed or seriously injured on the job. This stems from very real threats faced by law enforcement every day. Police have a dangerous job with a significant risk of harm or even death." But the statement calls us into ethical action, asking us to demand humane treatment with zero tolerance for excessive force, to ask local police departments to examine the use of warrior cop training and how that training affects the behavior of police in nonviolent encounters, to demand that police training includes conflict resolution and de-escalation skills. Pulling out a weapon should not be an officer's first response in a non-threatening situation, and to stand by to witness and possibly record interactions between the police and individuals who might be at risk, because our presence alone may reduce the risk of police violence. We must also recognize, support, and celebrate Black members like the Brooklyn Society's own Rita Wilson, who started Lucy's Children discussion group in order to create a greater cross-cultural understanding. Wilson said, "One of our main objectives is to elicit the best in ourselves and in others. It's important to keep an open mind and to keep looking at people as humans rather than categorizing. But it's not easy to move beyond our indoctrinations." She started the group because white members from the Brooklyn Society were coming up to her and asking, "What is it that we can do?" And she would tell them, "You can be of support by helping to bring attention to the matter amongst your peers, by meeting regularly to come up with ideas for creating a resolution." She's really, really onto something there. And Brooklyn Black poet, artist, activist, and storyteller Kim Brandon called Wilson her ethical compass. American feminist and secular humanist Sikim Hutchinson implores us to meet Black humanists where they are and work to help them solve the problems and challenges they face. She argues that if humanism is to have any relevance to Black youth, it must be grounded in their realities. She points to the scorn and stigma that prevents Black humanists, non-believers, agnostics, and skeptics from speaking up about their views or questioning faith-based assumptions, equating religion and belief in God with morality. Young Black female non-believers also face the threat of being adultified and hypersexualized. Hutchinson says the mainstream invisibility of humanist principles and values is another deterrent from espousing alternative views. We must be present in our popular culture. She calls attention to the skyrocketing rates of depression, suicidal ideation, and suicide among Black girls and Black queer youth, who are also precipitated by toxic, anti-Black, misogynist, homophobic, and transphobic school climates that silence and victim shame female identified queer youth, violence survivors. She says, as our youth continue to bear the brunt of this nation's mental health crisis, humanist organizations must step up to meet the challenge or risk becoming obsolete. She adds, youth leadership, therapy, art-based, and community building opportunities can provide coping resources for and safe havens from the unrelenting violence youth of color experience in their everyday lives. The connection to humanistic alternatives of care are clear in neighborhoods where churches may provide the only physical safe after-school extracurricular space for Black and brown youth. Access to non-faith-based resources is imperative. As we cultivate and curate the ethical culture, the ethical humanism of the future, it is worth asking the question, what would our movement look like without the contributions of Black humanists and Black freethinkers? I think it would not look the same at all. It would definitely be less impactful and inclusive. I challenge us all to foster Black humanism and help grow its unique strength. Inclusion brings diversity, and diversity is an essential, revered asset in ethical culture. And without the inclusion of Black Americans, our movement simply cannot survive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. Oh,